A woman with no past walked into town. Every child recognized her face from a painting in the church. The dust had memory in Dry Gulch. It remembered the blood of the Comanche raids, the tears of widows, the laughter of children long buried beneath the mesquite. And on that September afternoon, when the heat made the horizon shimmer like water that would never come, the dust remembered something else, something that made even the wind hold its breath. She came walking out of the desert like a mirage given flesh, her bare feet leaving prints that seemed too light for any living thing. The children saw her first, as children always see what adults refuse to acknowledge. Little Maria Gonzalez dropped her corn husk doll in the dirt, her mouth forming a perfect circle of wonder. "Mama," she whispered, though her mother stood frozen 20 feet away, clutching her market basket like a shield. The woman wore a dress that might have been blue once, before the sun and sand had their way with it. Her hair fell in dark waves past her waist, untouched by the desert wind that bent everything else to its will. But it was her face that stopped the world, a face that every soul in Dry Gulch had stared at for hours in the cool shadows of San Miguel's chapel, painted in oils and gilt on wood carried from Spain 200 years ago. Our Lady of Sorrows, La Virgen de los Dolores. The resemblance was not approximate. It was absolute. Father Miguel had been tending his small garden of herbs behind the church, coaxing life from soil that preferred death. The shovel fell from his hands when he saw her, the metal ringing against stone like a bell tolling backwards. His knees, which had knelt on cold chapel floors for 40 years, suddenly forgot their purpose. The rosary beads at his waist clicked together in the trembling. "Dios mío," he breathed. It was neither prayer nor curse, but something suspended between worlds. The woman moved through the town's single street with the deliberate grace of one who had walked through many towns and many times. Her eyes, those terrible, beautiful eyes that held the weight of every mother's grief since Eve wept over Abel, swept across the faces turning away, the doors closing, the hands reaching for rifles and crosses in equal measure. But the children followed. They always followed. Tommy Morrison, the blacksmith's boy with hair like prairie grass, reached out to touch the hem of her dress. His fingers came away dusty, proving she was real, though what manner of real remained a question the afternoon couldn't answer. Behind him, a dozen other children formed a strange procession, their usual wildness replaced by something ancient and solemn. The woman spoke no word. Words were for creatures bound by single lifetimes, and her silence suggested otherwise. At the saloon, Big Pete Martinez stopped polishing glasses. The poker game in the corner died mid-hand, cards falling like autumn leaves. Someone's whiskey sat untouched, a miracle in itself. Through the batwing doors, they watched her pass, and more than one hardened man felt tears threatening that hadn't come since childhood. "Ain't natural," muttered Jay Coleman, who'd killed 7 men and feared nothing that walked on legs. But his gun hand trembled as he said it, and he didn't reach for iron. She stopped at the well in the town's center, where the wooden bucket hung on rope worn smooth by countless hands. The water she drew came up clearer than anyone remembered, though the well had been murky for months. She drank with the careful movements of one who knew thirst intimately, then set the bucket down with a gentleness that made the watching women weep without knowing why. Father Miguel had found his feet by then, following at a distance that felt both too close and impossibly far. His mind cycled through scripture and heresy, seeking explanation in texts written by men who'd never walked where heaven touched earth without invitation. Behind him, others followed, the faithful and the doubting alike, drawn by something older than doctrine. The woman turned toward the church, and that's when the real fear began. Not the clean fear of Apache raids or drought or death, but the terrible fear of the sacred made manifest without warning or interpretation. Her shadow fell across the threshold of San Miguel's, and the mesquite doors, which had never closed properly, swung open of their own accord. Inside, candles that had been snuffed for economy blazed alife. The painted Virgin on the wall seemed to shimmer, as if recognizing something of herself in the stranger. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Father Miguel's hands shook as he crossed himself. "If you were a sign," he began, but the words crumbled like old adobe. Signs were supposed to come with instructions. This woman came with only silence, and those eyes that had seen the cross raised and the stone rolled away, that had watched sons leave and not return, that knew every variation of human grief, and somehow remained unbroken. She knelt before the altar, and her kneeling was like water finding its level. The children filled the pews behind her, quiet as they'd never been during Sunday Mass. The adults crowded the doorway, afraid to enter, unable to leave. And in that moment, suspended between heartbeats, Dry Gulch remembered what it had forgotten in its years of survival and small sins, that the divine was not comfortable, not kind in any way humans understood kindness. It was terrible and beautiful and absolutely foreign to the world of water rights and cattle prices and Saturday night dances. The woman who wore yesterday's face bowed her head, and her prayer, if prayer it was, made no sound. Outside, the dust continued its eternal dance, carrying the memory of this moment to places that would deny it had ever happened. But the children would remember. They always remembered what adults tried to forget. And Father Miguel, standing in his own church like a stranger, wondered if faith was supposed to feel like drowning in reverse. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. And still she knelt, and still they watched, and still the candles burned with flames that threw no shadows. The schoolhouse had been empty for 3 years, since the teacher died of fever and no replacement dared venture to Dry Gulch. Dust had claimed the desks, and mice had made nests in the McGuffey readers. But when the woman entered, the air itself seemed to remember what learning tasted like, chalk and curiosity and the sweet ache of growing minds. Sheriff Tom Harlan watched from his office window, his coffee growing cold in the tin cup. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, had faced down Apache raids and claim jumpers, had buried men whose names he never learned. But this woman who wore the Virgin's face like some folks wore sorrow, she made his badge feel heavy as a millstone. Inside the schoolhouse, she moved with purpose that transcended the mere arrangement of space. Her hands, brown as desert earth but smooth as river stones, swept surfaces clean without raising dust. The children who'd followed her from the church stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter this transformed space that had been their kingdom of neglect. "Come," she said. It was the first word anyone had heard her speak. The word fell like rain on drought-baked soil, and the children obeyed as if they'd been waiting all their lives for just that invitation. Deputy Will Carson burst through the sheriff's door, his youth making him reckless where older men grew careful. "Tom, we got to do something. Folks are getting scared." Mary Henderson's locked herself in her root cellar, swearing it's the end times. And Big Pete, he's been cleaning his shotgun for the past hour. Harlan didn't turn from the window. Below, he could see the woman through the schoolhouse's broken panes, her movements deliberate as prayer. "What would you have me do, Will?" "Arrest her for having a face, for disturbing the peace," Carson said, but the words came out uncertain. For being unnatural. Since when is feeding children unnatural? The deputy's hand moved to his gun belt, where 6 bullets caught the afternoon light. He'd spent the morning filing crosses into their tips, melting silver coins his grandmother had left him to coat the lead. If she was something unholy, he reasoned, the silver would tell the truth of it. If she was holy, well, the silver wouldn't mind. "My ma used to say the devil comes in pleasing forms," Carson muttered. "Your ma also said tobacco would grow hair on your palms," Harlan replied. "Yet here you are, smooth-handed and chain-smoking." Through the window, they watched the woman produce bread from somewhere. Not the flat hardtack the town was used to, but loaves that seemed to multiply in her hands. She broke them with the same careful grace she'd shown at the well, and the children ate like they'd never tasted bread before. Maybe they hadn't. Not bread like this, which filled more than stomachs. Little Maria Gonzalez sat closest to the woman, her corn-husk doll forgotten on the floor. She chewed slowly, as if trying to memorize the taste. Tommy Morrison had tears streaming down his face, though he ate steadily, mechanically, like a boy who'd learned hunger too young. "There's 12 of them in there," Carson said, his voice tight. 12 children. Like the apostles. Or like a dozen hungry kids who found someone willing to feed them, Harlan countered, but he felt the weight of the number too. Everything about this woman seemed heavy with meaning, like the world had suddenly become a book written in a language he'd forgotten he once knew. The door to the sheriff's office opened again. Father Miguel entered, his cassock dusty from kneeling, his face carrying the peculiar exhaustion of a man who'd wrestled with angels and lost. "She's still in the church," he said, then stopped, confused. "But I saw her go to the schoolhouse." "She's in the schoolhouse," Harlan confirmed, pointing. The priest moved to the window, and his intake of breath was sharp as cactus. Through the broken glass, they could see her clearly. The woman who wore yesterday's face, surrounded by children, breaking bread with hands that had never known calluses. By location, Father Miguel whispered. Some saints could be in 2 places at once. Saints didn't typically show up in towns like Dry Gulch, Carson said, his fingers worrying the silver bullets. "Neither did miracles," the priest replied. "Perhaps that's why one finally came." The woman looked up then, straight at the window where 3 men stood watching. Her eyes held no accusation, no invitation, just an acknowledgement that they existed in the same moment, breathing the same desert air. Harlan felt something shift in his chest, like a bone setting back into place after years of walking crooked. "If we're going to shoot her," he said quietly, "we'd best decide if it's for being too good or not good enough." Carson's hand stilled on his gun. What if she's neither? What if she's just different? "Then God help us," Father Miguel said, "because we've forgotten how to live with different." Outside, the sun continued its relentless journey toward evening. The bread in the schoolhouse was nearly gone, but the children showed no signs of leaving. They sat in a circle around the woman, their faces turned up like flowers following light. She began to speak, too low for the watching men to hear. But whatever story she told made the children lean in, made their eyes go wide with wonder instead of fear. "I'm going over there," Harlan decided, setting down his cold coffee. "Tom," Carson started. "I'm going to do my job," the sheriff said. "Keep the peace." And right now, the only peace being disturbed is in the hearts of folks too scared to accept a gift when it's given. He reached for his hat, then paused. "We'll keep those silver bullets handy. But maybe think on why you're so eager to use them on someone whose only crime is feeding hungry children." The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. Through the window, Carson and Father Miguel watched the sheriff cross the dusty street, his shadow long in the slanting light. The woman looked up at his approach, and for just a moment, her face showed something that might have been sorrow or might have been joy. Or might have been both, because in the end, weren't they always wrapped around each other like lovers or fighters, impossible to separate? The priest began to pray, not knowing whether he prayed for the sheriff's safety or for his courage, while Deputy Carson counted his silver bullets one more time, wondering if faith always felt this much like fear. And in the schoolhouse, the bread kept breaking, and the children kept eating, and the woman kept giving, as if she had all the time in the world to love them. Father Miguel's hands trembled as he lifted the church registry from its hiding place beneath the altar. The leather binding had gone soft with age, pages yellowed like autumn cottonwood leaves. He'd consulted this book 1,000 times for marriages and deaths, but tonight he searched for something else, the origins of the painting that had watched over Dry Gulch since before memory became history. The woman knelt before her own image, still as stone except for the tears that fell without sound. Each drop caught the candlelight before disappearing into the hard-packed earth of the church floor. Sheriff Harlan stood guard by the door, his presence a thin barrier between sanctuary and the growing anger outside. "Found it," Father Miguel whispered, his finger tracing words written in Spanish, so old it took him 3 tries to understand. 1825. The painting arrived with Brother Francisco Delgado, who claimed. The priest's voice failed him. "What did he claim?" Harlan asked. though his eyes never left the window where torch flames danced like angry spirits. He claimed to paint what God showed him in visions. The bishop called him mad, said he painted the future instead of the past. Father Miguel looked up at the woman, then back at the registry. He painted Our Lady of Sorrows, but said she would walk the earth again when the world had forgotten how to recognize holiness. The woman's shoulders moved with a breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. When she spoke, her voice was raw with disuse, as if words were foreign things she'd only just remembered how to shape. Francisco wept when he painted my face. He begged forgiveness for the burden of being seen before being known. Outside, Big Pete's voice rose above the crowd's murmur. She's bewitched our children, fed them devil's bread. My boy won't come home, says he wants to stay with her. Your boy hasn't had a full meal in months, someone countered. Mary Henderson emerged from her root cellar to face a different fear. Maybe that's the real witchcraft. Father Miguel approached the woman slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal or a miracle, unsure which would require more courage. Are you what Brother Francisco painted? She raised her face to his, and in the candlelight, the resemblance to the painting became something beyond mere similarity. It was recognition, the way a mother knows her child's cry in a crowd of thousands. I am what sorrow becomes when it has nowhere else to go. I am what faith looks like when it stops asking for rewards. That's blasphemy, Harlan said quietly, but without conviction. Is it? The woman rose from her knees with a grace that made the simple movement seem like dance. Or is blasphemy when a town lets children starve while grown men count their coins? When a church stands empty except for Sunday mornings, because desperation doesn't follow service schedules? The mob's noise grew louder. Through the windows, they could see Deputy Carson trying to maintain order, his hand never leaving his gun belt where those silver bullets waited. The young man's face was torn between duty and doubt, between the law he'd sworn to uphold and the deeper law written and bread broken for hungry children. They're going to burn the church, Father Miguel said, surprised by how calm he sounded. They'd rather destroy the mystery than live with questions. The woman moved to the painting, studying it as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the last. Francisco saw truly. He painted not just my face, but my purpose, to come when faith had become fear, when mercy was considered weakness, when children knew hunger better than hope. Why here? Harlan asked. Why Dry Gulch? Because forgotten places remember best, she replied. Because those who have nothing recognize everything. A stone crashed through the window, scattering glass like fallen stars across the floor. The mob was finding its courage in numbers, that ancient alchemy that transforms fear into violence. Father Miguel clutched his registry, wondering if faith always demanded such terrible choices. I could arrest you, Harlan said to the woman. Take you into custody. It might satisfy them. Would it satisfy you? The sheriff's silence was answer enough. Another stone, another window. The torches were coming closer, and with them the sharp smell of kerosene. Someone had thought to bring fuel for more than just torches. Father Miguel felt his heart break for his little church, for the baptismal font where he'd christened half the town, for the confessional where secrets became forgiveness. There's a back way, he said suddenly, through the sacristy. You could leave, disappear back into the desert. The woman smiled then, and it was terrible and beautiful, like sunrise over a battlefield. I didn't come to disappear. I came to be seen, to remind you that heaven looks nothing like your expectations. The front doors shuddered under the first blow. Big Pete had found an axe. The sound echoed through the sanctuary like judgment. Then what happens now? Harlan asked, his hand finally moving to his gun, though whether to defend or attack, even he didn't know. Now you choose, the woman said simply, between the safety of certainty and the danger of grace. Between the God you've created and the God who creates. Another blow. The doors were strong, built to last, but not forever. Nothing lasted forever except the things that mattered, and Dry Gulch was still learning which things those were. Father Miguel set down the registry and picked up the chalice from the altar. It was silver, brought from Spain like the painting, like the faith that had traveled so far to rest in this forgotten corner of creation. He filled it with wine and lifted it high. "This is my blood," he said, though no mass was scheduled, though the church was under siege, though everything he'd been taught said sacraments required proper forms and permissions. The woman took the chalice and drank, then handed it to Harlan. The sheriff stared at it like a man seeing water after 40 days in the desert. Outside, his town was choosing fear. Inside, 3 souls stood at the edge of a different choice. The doors gave way with a sound like the world ending, or perhaps beginning. Torchlight flooded the sanctuary, casting wild shadows that made the painted Virgin seem to move, seem to weep, seem to open her arms in invitation or warning. Big Pete stood in the doorway, axe in hand, righteousness burning in his eyes. Behind him, the mob waited for permission to destroy what they couldn't understand. And in that moment of suspension, between breath and violence, between fear and faith, Sheriff Tom Harlan raised the chalice to his lips and drank deeply. The woman who wore yesterday's face smiled, and her tears continued to fall, watering ground that had been dry too long. Outside, a child's voice rose above the mob's anger. Little Maria Gonzalez, calling for her mother, calling for the woman who had fed her, calling for something the adults had forgotten how to name. And in that space between heartbeats, between choices, between worlds, Dry Gulch trembled on the edge of remembering why angels were always telling people not to be afraid. Dawn came to Dry Gulch like forgiveness, slow, inevitable, and more beautiful than the night's sins deserved. The mob had dissolved somewhere between rage and wonder, their torches extinguished by something stronger than water. Now they stood in scattered groups, parents searching for children who had already found what they were looking for. The woman walked ahead, 12 small shadows following her toward the desert's edge. She sang as she walked, words in a language that predated maps and fences, that remembered when the land knew no borders save those between earth and sky. The children hummed along, learning the melody if not the meaning, their voices thin as morning light but growing stronger with each step. Sheriff Harlan stood at the town's boundary, his gun heavy in its holster. He'd drawn it 3 times during the night, once for duty, once for fear, and once for the kind of desperation that makes men mistake violence for solution. 3 times he'd lowered it, unable to fire at something that looked so much like hope walking on tired feet. "She's taking them," Deputy Carson said, appearing at his elbow. The young man's face showed the exhaustion of one who'd wrestled angels and demons both, unsure which had won. "The children. She's taking them away." "No," Harlan corrected, watching little Maria Gonzalez skip beside the woman, her corn-husk doll clutched like a talisman. "She's teaching them to leave. There's a difference." Behind them, Father Miguel emerged from his church, carrying the painting that had watched over Dry Gulch for 100 years. In the morning light, something impossible was happening. The oils were fading, the ancient face dissolving like mist. Where the Virgin's sorrowful eyes had gazed, blank canvas emerged, white as possibility. "Look," the priest whispered, though whether in horror or wonder, none could say. The painting was returning to emptiness, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, its promise kept. Brother Francisco's mad vision was completing itself, leaving only stretched cloth and the memory of what holiness looked like when it wore a human face. Big Pete Martinez approached, his axe forgotten somewhere in the night's confusion. His boy walked with the woman's group, back straight, no longer the hunched creature who'd learned to make himself small to avoid his father's rages. "My boy," Pete said, and the words carried all the weight of lost chances. "He'll come back," Father Miguel offered, "when he's learned what she's teaching." "What's she teaching them?" Pete's voice broke like drought-season earth. "To sing," the priest replied. "To remember they're more than their hunger. To know they deserve bread without having to earn it through suffering." The woman stopped at an outcrop of red stone, where the desert began its serious business of emptiness. The children gathered around her, and she knelt to their level, speaking words too soft for the watching adults to hear. One by one, she touched their foreheads, and one by one, they began to walk back toward town, but differently. They moved like children who'd remembered they were allowed to be children. Tommy Morrison reached his parents first, his prairie grass hair wilder than ever, his face shining with something that made his mother weep. She said, "We already know everything we need," he announced. "We just forgot to remember it." Maria Gonzalez ran to her mother, the corn-husk doll suddenly seeming less like a poor girl's toy and more like a treasure worthy of protection. "She taught me a song about the time before sadness," the child said. "Want to hear it?" One by one, the children returned, carrying songs and stories, carrying a lightness that Dry Gulch had forgotten existed. They spoke of bread that tasted like home, of water that remembered every rain since creation, of a woman whose tears could water dead ground back to life. Only one child remained with the woman, a boy nobody recognized, thin as winter branches, with eyes that had seen too much. Where he'd come from, none could say. Perhaps he'd always been there, invisible in his hunger, waiting for someone to see him truly. "Will she come back?" Carson asked, his hand no longer reaching for weapons. Harlan shook his head slowly. "Does sunrise come back? It never leaves. We just close our eyes to it." The woman and the unknown boy turned toward the deep desert, their figures growing smaller, but never less significant. The morning sun painted their shadows long across the sand, and for a moment, just a moment, those shadows looked like wings. Father Miguel held up the blank canvas, marveling at its emptiness. "We'll need a new painting." "No," Harlan said firmly. "We'll need to remember why we needed one in the first place." The church bells began to ring, though no one pulled the ropes. They rang with a sound like laughter and weeping combined, like all the prayers that had gone unanswered until they were answered in ways too strange for gratitude. The town listened, and in that listening, something shifted. Mary Henderson opened her root cellar and began distributing preserves she'd hoarded against apocalypse. Big Pete put away his gun and picked up his son, holding him like the miracle he'd always been. The saloon offered free water to anyone who thirsted, and for once, water seemed enough. In the distance, the woman's song continued, growing fainter but never disappearing entirely. The desert would remember it, adding it to its catalog of things that shouldn't exist but do. Rivers that run uphill, flowers that bloom without rain, women who are the faces of paintings and teach children to sing in languages older than sorrow. Sheriff Harlan turned back toward town, his badge catching light like a promise. Beside him, Father Miguel carried his empty canvas like a man carrying seeds for a garden not yet planted. Deputy Carson walked with them, his silver bullets forgotten in his pocket, no longer needed in a world where mystery had proven kinder than certainty. The children's voices rose in a new song they'd learned, filling Dry Gulch with music it didn't deserve but had been given anyway. And somewhere in that music was the truth the woman had carried with her, that grace comes not to the worthy, but to the willing, not to the righteous, but to the empty-handed, not to those who demand miracles, but to those who become them. The sun climbed higher, and Dry Gulch began another day, forever changed by a woman who wore yesterday's face and tomorrow's promise, leaving only today for the town to fill with whatever holiness they could find in bread broken, water shared, and children singing songs in languages they were only just beginning to understand.